The first sound I remember was not the echo of my own footsteps, but the way rain whispered against the high panes of the Bodleian. A night storm, persistent and unhurried, had already darkened Oxford into a palette of greys, and the streets outside were slick as though newly varnished. I had come seeking nothing more than the cold assurance of silence, but the library never truly grants silence. Books rustle in their bindings. Wood creaks beneath the weight of memory. Even air finds ways of shifting its presence, like a guest unwilling to leave. Lewis had joined me reluctantly, his eyes straying often to the clock above the entrance, as if measuring the waste of hours in bricks and mortar. He asked if this was necessary, and I told him that necessity is a word with only unimaginative use. He sighed, and we walked on together beneath the fan-vaulted roof, a place that had outlived centuries and would outlive us both. The attendant had said that no one else remained. Yet there was the faintest sound, as of something brushed aside on a distant desk. Lewis noticed it too, though he dismissed it with a shrug. I waited because small sounds are rarely small in meaning. When we finally reached Duke Humphrey's, I paused before the long oak tables. A single chair was drawn back, the lamp above it still glowing, and upon the surface of the desk an opened volume unattended, but not abandoned. I traced my hand across the margin where a reader's fingers had lingered. The inked letters were blurred at one corner, smudged by recent touch. I felt certain someone had been there within minutes of our arrival. Lewis said perhaps the fellow had slipped out by another staircase. Perhaps. But why leave a book open to the entry for a 17th-century trial? And why underline faintly the name of a woman executed in July 1628? Lewis told me it was a coincidence. Coincidence. Yes, the most abused refuge of the careless mind. I reminded him of the crossword earlier that morning, where the clue had asked for a 7-letter word meaning unlooked for. Serendip, of course, the shortened form of serendipity. Chance discovery. The word had lodged itself in my thoughts, and here it was again, whispering across the centuries from the faded spine of a forgotten folio. We moved on, though my mind did not. Down the narrow stair we descended, the stone uneven beneath our soles. At each turn the air grew damper, as though reluctant to leave the storm outside. I thought of the anonymous hand that had underlined the name in the book, someone who believed that history still mattered enough to disturb. It was not history they sought, but vindication or perhaps concealment. People consult the past not out of love but out of need. That is what makes it dangerous. At the lower passage we encountered the porter again. He asked if all was in order. Lewis answered briskly. I merely nodded, though in truth nothing felt in order. I could still sense the quiet presence of another, shadow folded carefully into the fabric of the place. The porter assured us that no one had left by the main entrance for nearly an hour, which meant either the man had found another way or was still within those walls, pressed against their history. We left the library and stepped into the drizzle of Radcliffe Square. The cobbles shone black, reflecting the lampposts as though each light had doubled. Lewis muttered that we should get a pint before closing time. I agreed too easily. But inside I was already assembling the pattern of a puzzle that had not yet been set before me. I recalled the underlined name Agnes Cartwright, condemned for theft and witchcraft. What caught me was not the accusation, nor the archaic phrasing of her sentence, but the way the final letter of her name had been retraced twice, as though the hand had faltered. A hesitation, or perhaps an echo of grief. I have always trusted hesitations more than declarations. They are the seams through which truth begins to emerge. The rain thickened as we crossed toward Broad Street. I slowed my pace, listening once more to the vaulted silence that now lay behind me, its echo carried in the blood. Oxford often withholds its secrets until one has ceased to demand them. That night, however, I felt its walls had chosen to whisper. Only later did I understand how faint such whispers can be, and how dangerous when ignored. It was Lewis who first noticed the envelope lying awkwardly on the porter's desk, half hidden beneath a discarded copy of the Times. I had paused in the doorway, reluctant to step inside, because the lodge always smelled of tobacco long after the last pipe had been tapped out, and there was something in that lingering odour that reminded me of mortality. A place where men sat through long nights and grew old waiting for bells that no longer rang. The porter, a fellow called Graham, greeted us with the exaggerated cheer of one who had already grown weary of solitude. He offered us tea. Lewis accepted with the habitual gratitude of a man for whom such gestures still mattered. I declined, scanning the desk, my attention drawn back to that envelope. It had no stamp, no university crest, merely a name in black ink, written in a hand that was neither hurried nor elegant. Deliberate, that was the word. A hand that wished to be noticed and yet disguised itself as ordinary. I asked Graham who had left it. He looked uncertain, then said a young woman had delivered it at dusk. She wore a scarf about her hair, he added, as though the detail might explain everything. I asked whether she had spoken, only to say it was for Mr. Ashton, and that it must be placed directly into his hands. Graham had not seen Ashton that evening, but he had promised to leave it waiting. We both looked down at the desk where the promise had faltered. Lewis asked if Ashton might have already collected it. Graham shook his head. He had not left his post. I reached out, turned the envelope over, unsealed. Careless or confident, I could not yet decide. Inside, a single sheet, folded twice. On it, just one line, written with the same deliberate strokes: "You cannot bury what still breathes." Lewis muttered that it sounded like some undergraduate prank. I said perhaps, but pranks usually try harder at wit. There was no humour in this, only certainty. I asked if Ashton had received other messages. Graham hesitated, then confessed there had been 2 before, both anonymous. One slipped under the lodge door in spring, the other left on Ashton's bicycle in July. He had mentioned them with a kind of shrug, as if shrugging could render words harmless. I replaced the paper, slid the envelope back onto the desk. Graham asked if we wished him to inform Ashton. I told him no, not yet. It seemed to me that the truest value of a letter lies not in its delivery, but in its delay. I have always believed that words left waiting on a desk reveal more than those eagerly received. Lewis frowned, but said nothing. He knew better than to interrupt when my mind had caught a thread. As we left the lodge, the bells of St. Mary's told the hour, though I cannot now recall which. The night air was damp, the kind of damp that clings to skin and memory alike. Lewis asked if I thought the line was a threat. I told him not every shadow hides a knife. Sometimes it merely conceals an old grief, unwilling to fade. He shook his head, muttered that I always saw ghosts where there were none. Yet it was Lewis who looked back at the lodge as if half expecting the young woman with the scarf to emerge from its doorway. I thought then of the crossword clue I had struggled with at lunchtime, a 5-letter word meaning both concealment and revelation. Veil. The answer had seemed too obvious, so I had doubted it. Yet here it was again, written across an evening, carried in a folded sheet of paper. A veil does not extinguish a face, it only delays recognition. And in Oxford, recognition has always been a dangerous business. We walked on in silence, though the words stayed with me, stitched invisibly to the damp air. You cannot bury what still breathes. Whoever had written it understood something most of us prefer to forget, that the past is never soil enough for the living. The Cherwell has always carried a kind of indifference, flowing past college gardens and half-forgotten meadows with the steady patience of time itself. That morning it was swollen with rain, the surface dark as slate, moving faster than it seemed. Lewis and I stood on the bank not far from Magdalen, the towers blurred in the mist. A constable had strung the tape too close to the water's edge, and the breeze played with it as though it were nothing more than laundry left untended. The body lay where the current had chosen to yield it, snagged against a tangle of reeds. A punt pole jutted upward nearby, abandoned, its handle marked with fresh mud. The first impression was simple enough. A man had slipped, perhaps struck his head, and the river had performed its quiet, remorseless work. But Oxford seldom permits its tragedies to remain simple. There is always the other side of the coin, the part minted with silence and shadow. Lewis crouched, his boots sinking slightly in the sodden ground, and observed that the deceased was not dressed for rowing. A suit, tie loosened, one shoe missing. The pockets, when turned out, revealed no wallet, no keys. He asked if I thought of robbery. I said robbery usually leaves behind fear, a scuffle, some trace of panic. Here there was only stillness, even in death. A student passing along the path had claimed to recognize him. Mr. Ashton, he had said, the lecturer in history. The same Ashton, of course, for whom the letter had been left in the porter's lodge the previous evening. Coincidence, Lewis suggested again, though with less conviction this time. I reminded him of the line in the envelope, "You cannot bury what still breathes." Perhaps the river had been asked to perform that burial. Perhaps it had declined. The police surgeon arrived, a little breathless from the mud, and murmured that the time of death was sometime in the small hours. He gestured toward the bruise beneath the man's left temple, uncertain whether it was caused by stone or hand. Lewis lit a cigarette he did not enjoy and remarked that Ashton had been scheduled to lecture on witch trials that very morning. I thought again of the underlined name in the library folio, Agnes Cartwright, condemned without mercy. Her name now seemed less like an echo from the past and more like a summons. The rain began again, fine and persistent, settling across our coats. I stepped closer to the bank, eyes tracing the waterline. There was something faintly out of place, a pattern pressed into the mud, half washed away. Not a footprint, but the square impression of a case, perhaps a briefcase or box, set down heavily before being lifted again. I mentioned it to Lewis, who frowned, unable to see why it mattered. I told him the river tells only half a story, and the ground must carry the rest. The constable wrapped the body in a covering, respectful in his clumsiness. A punt drifted into view, its tourists hushed by the scene, the laughter of minutes earlier stilled. Oxford loves its spectators, I thought. Even death attracts them, as though sorrow itself were part of the curriculum. Lewis asked where I believed Ashton had entered the water. Upstream, I said, though not far. A man seldom travels willingly into darkness for long. The reeds here, I noted, were broken inward, not outward, as though someone had pushed from behind. He looked at me uneasily and asked if I was certain. I told him certainty is reserved for fools and priests. I had only deduction, and deduction is always provisional. We walked back toward the bridge, the drizzle settling into the folds of our silence. A cyclist passed, tires hissing against the wet path, and I envied him for his uncomplicated direction. I wondered what Ashton's final thought had been, whether he had remembered a line of poetry or regretted some unopened letter, perhaps nothing at all. Death often arrives with less ceremony than we grant it. As we reached the roadway, Lewis remarked that the crossword in that morning's paper had been unusually difficult. He had managed only a single clue, a 7-letter word for deception, mirage. The answer lingered in my mind, refracting itself against the water still coursing beneath the bridge. Mirage, something that promises solidity but offers none. Ashton's life, his letter, the bruise at his temple, all as insubstantial as reflections, and yet reflections have a way of drawing us nearer until we mistake them for the truth itself. That evening, long after the rain had ceased, I poured a whiskey in my flat and listened to the Choirboy in memory, flowing with its usual indifference, carrying its secrets beyond the reach of lanterns. But I could not silence the thought that someone had placed him there, not the river alone, and that the true current was only just beginning to pull us under. Music halls and chapels never feel entirely different to me. Both ask the audience to surrender, to listen with the heart as much as with the ear. That evening, however, as I sat with Lewis in the echoing half-light of Holywell Music Room, I found myself listening not only for the cadence of voices, but for the tiny ruptures beneath them. Suspicion often comes dressed in harmony, and discord reveals itself only if one waits long enough. The college choir rehearsed madrigals, bright fragments of joy sung in counterpoint to the weather outside. Rain on stone, always rain, Oxford's only reliable instrument. Among the singers were 3 whose names had already found their way into my notes. Miss Elkins, a graduate student in history, pale and composed, her eyes rarely straying from the score. Mr. Fielding, a baritone, though his voice carried too much strain for his years, his smile stretched to conceal it. And Dr. Blake, senior tutor, who conducted with more precision than warmth, his hand movements clipped as if he mistrusted beauty unless disciplined into order. Lewis leaned over, whispered that we were wasting time. I reminded him that criminals, like singers, reveal themselves in rehearsal more readily than in performance. He grunted, though not without some reluctant curiosity. Between the songs there were small exchanges. Elkins turned pages for her neighbour, but never looked at him. Fielding cracked a joke that failed, his laugh too long, too rehearsed. Blake corrected a soprano on a note she had already sung correctly. Each detail is ordinary, and yet together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. I wrote nothing down, preferring memory. Notes mislead more often than they illuminate. When rehearsal ended, I approached them one by one, the way a man might test chords on an old piano, listening for a string out of tune. I asked Elkins how well she had known Ashton. She said only as a lecturer, her tone flat, as if intimacy had never been possible. But her hand, resting on the back of a chair, trembled just slightly when she spoke his name. I told her I admired her concentration during the rehearsal. She answered that music is easier than history because music ends when the score does. It was a remark that lingered longer than she perhaps intended. Fielding was easier, too eager. He spoke of Ashton with admiration and insisted that the man had often helped him with essays. But admiration, when genuine, seldom requires such repetition. He mentioned having seen Ashton near the river earlier in the week. Alone, he added quickly. I asked if Ashton had seemed troubled. Fielding said he had not noticed. That was answer enough. To claim not to notice is always a form of noticing. Blake, however, gave little away. He regarded me with the weary politeness of a man accustomed to authority. He said Ashton had been unreliable of late, distracted, careless with lectures. I asked if he believed Ashton had enemies. He replied that in academia, colleagues seldom make enemies, they simply wait for one another to fail. His hand, meanwhile, tapped lightly against the rolled score he carried, beating out a rhythm that did not match the conversation. I wondered what music was playing silently behind his words. Later, as Lewis and I walked back toward Broad Street, he asked which of them I suspected. I told him all of them, and none of them. Suspicion is a melody one hears, but the harmony is harder to pin down. He said I was being obscure again, perhaps, but obscurity often hides the only truth available. Back in my room, I poured a measure of whiskey and unfolded the crossword left on the table. One clue remained unsolved, a songbird concealing intent in 6. I considered it while the rain pressed against the window. Linnet, I realized at last, a bird known more for sweetness than cunning. Yet even sweetness can conceal. I circled the answer and set the paper aside. The faces from rehearsal returned to me then, framed in candlelight, their voices still weaving patterns in the dimness of memory. Each had sung, each had faltered in ways too slight for most to hear, but I had heard, and I knew that among those notes dissonance was waiting to be named. There are figures that Oxford invents for itself, shadows stitched into the fabric of its evenings. The woman in black was one of them. At first sight she might have been any mourner late from a service, her coat too long, her veil falling to the chin. Yet there was something in her walk, deliberate, measured, as if she expected to be followed and intended to remain half a step ahead of pursuit. Lewis had spotted her outside the Randolph, where she paused in the drizzle beneath a street lamp, her face obscured, her gloved hands restless at her sides. He asked if I thought her suspicious. I said, "Suspicion is merely a word we attach to whatever unsettles us." She unsettled me. That was reason enough to follow. We kept a distance as she crossed St. Giles, her shoes clicking against the wet pavement with a rhythm that felt almost rehearsed. She turned toward Jericho, where the streets narrow and the lamps grow further apart. The rain had become mist by then, wrapping everything in a gauze that made even Lewis's silhouette seem spectral. At one corner she halted, looked briefly into a shop window, dark, closed for hours, and touched the glass with her hand before moving on. A gesture too intimate for glass, too intimate for anything unobserved. I remembered it later. She led us eventually toward the canal. The water lay still, broken only by the ripple of a passing swan. She lingered near a moored barge, its paint peeling, the curtains drawn. For several minutes she stood as if listening to something inside. Then, without knocking, she turned back and retraced her path. Lewis whispered that she must live nearby. I said no, she was leaving nothing behind, only ensuring that something unseen remained intact. We did not approach her that night, though I caught the faint fragrance of tobacco smoke as she passed, sharper than any perfume. It clung to her like a confession. When she vanished into the arc of Broad Street, I told Lewis we would see her again. He asked how I could be sure. "Because Oxford never creates a ghost without purpose," I said. And this one had already been written into the margins of Ashton's death. The next afternoon I returned alone to the canal. The barge remained moored, silent, its name painted in fading letters, Persephone. An irony, perhaps, though coincidences seldom choose their disguises so neatly. A boy on a bicycle stopped to watch me, then said the woman came there often, always dressed in black, always silent. I asked if she spoke to anyone. He shook his head, then added that she sometimes carried books, tied with a ribbon. The details lingered. Ribbons are chosen, not accidental. They suggest a ritual or a gift never delivered. That evening, as I sat with the crossword by the window, the clue that troubled me was a shadow walking 5 letters. The answer, so simple I nearly dismissed it, was wraith. I wrote it down, uneasy, for the word implied not absence but presence, something that insists on being seen, however insubstantial. The woman in black had that same insistence. She was no accident drifting through Oxford's rain. She wanted to be noticed. Lewis remained unconvinced. Perhaps she was grieving, he argued. Perhaps she had lost Ashton in ways we could not guess. I said perhaps, but grief seldom rehearses its footsteps so carefully, nor repeats them nightly along the same streets. She was not mourning, she was performing. I think now of the way she touched the shop window that first night, her hand lingering on the cold glass. It was not a gesture of longing, but of recognition, as though the pain concealed something. Meant only for her. The city is full of such secret gestures, handshakes unseen, doors unmarked, windows that open not to air, but to memory. She belonged to that realm, and by following her, however briefly, so did I. In the days that followed, I carried her silhouette with me, dark against the lamplight, purposeful against the rain. When we finally spoke, her words would matter less than the spaces between them. But that is still to come. For now, I remember only the measured rhythm of her steps and the certainty that some truths, like some songs, require silence before they can be heard. I have always trusted crosswords more than conversation. Words on a grid demand honesty from the solver, even when the clue itself conceals. That morning, I sat in the dim light of my rooms, pen poised, while Lewis shuffled the case files with the distracted air of a man who preferred conclusions to questions. He asked if I had made any progress. I told him I had solved one clue, 7 letters, double meaning, to conceal and to mislead. The answer was masking. He did not see why it mattered, but to me it always does. Masking, after all, was precisely what we had been watching unfold. He muttered something about wasting time when we had suspects to question. I reminded him that words reveal their own suspects if you care to notice them. He laughed, though half-heartedly, and returned to his notes. I left him to it and stared at the grid until the black and white squares blurred into the memory of a corridor, at the college stone floor, uneven, walls carrying the faint perfume of dust and ink. There, too, masking had been at work. The woman in black had crossed my thoughts again. Her silence had not been silence at all, but a kind of language written in steps and pauses. I told Lewis as much the night before. He said I was seeing patterns where none existed. I asked him if he remembered how she touched the shop window, her hand lingering too long. That was no accident, no casual pause. It was a signal, whether to memory or to another watcher. I could not yet decide. Later we sat across from Dr. Blake in his rooms, the shelves lined with titles that seemed to me chosen more for weight than wisdom. He spoke briskly of Ashton, of his flaws, of his distracted mind. Yet even as he condemned the dead, he rearranged the papers on his desk into neat piles, aligning their corners with a care too exact for comfort. I asked him whether Ashton had quarrelled with colleagues. He replied that disputes in academia were rarely quarrels. They were footnotes, sharp but bloodless. Still his hand tapped against the desk, a rhythm that betrayed more than his words. Outside, the quad lay heavy with drizzle, its flagstones slick. Lewis asked if I believed Blake guilty. I said belief is a word for churchgoers. I preferred deduction. And deduction told me that a man who aligns papers so precisely may also align fates, nudging them into order when they refuse to lie flat. We walked toward the Bodleian. The porter nodded as we passed, his eyes too knowing. He had grown accustomed, perhaps, to secrets passing through his lodge. In the corner of the desk, the crossword from yesterday still lay half-solved, abandoned by some student. I picked it up, my eye drawn to one clue, a purpose concealed within a puzzle, 9 letters. The answer, of course, was cross purposes. I smiled, though grimly. The word echoed through the case, as if the setters of fate had designed it for me alone. Lewis said I was being fanciful. He might have been right. Yet I could not shake the sense that each of them, Elkins, Fielding, Blake, and the woman in black, sang not from the same score but from overlapping ones, melodies that clashed when heard together. Their purposes crossed, their words misaligned, and in that discord Ashton had drowned. As the evening fell, I returned once more to my rooms. The crossword from the morning remained unfinished. I had filled in masking, but the rest of the grid defied me. I set the paper aside, poured myself a whiskey, and stared out into the darkening city. Somewhere among its stones the answer lingered, not in neat rows of letters, but in gestures half forgotten, pauses at windows, papers aligned too carefully, voices trembling on certain syllables. The clues had all been given. It was only my failure, for now, to arrange them. Crosswords do not reveal the truth, they demand it. And I knew that until I solved this particular grid, Ashton would not rest, and neither, I suspected, would I. It was late afternoon when the photograph arrived in my hands, though I could not say who first placed it there. Perhaps Graham in the lodge, perhaps Lewis from his stack of papers. The memory blurs, as it often does with objects that seem to appear rather than be delivered. It was tucked inside a folder of Ashton's effects, half-slipped between lecture notes and a receipt for a book never collected, not staged, not even consciously preserved, merely waiting to be found. The image itself was ordinary in the way all dangerous things are. A gathering in some college garden, chairs scattered across the lawn, glasses raised, a sense of laughter caught before it faded. At first glance, nothing sinister. Then I noticed her. At the edge of the group, partly obscured by shadow and foliage, the woman in black. Not veiled as when we had followed her, but her gaze direct, steady upon the lens. The others smiled, unaware of her intrusion. She did not smile. Lewis asked if I was certain. Perhaps she was someone else, he said, some cousin or visiting scholar. I told him certainty was a luxury rarely afforded, yet the line of the jaw, the tilt of the head, the unmistakable presence of someone who had never intended to be in the photograph at all, those were not inventions of my imagination. He asked how a woman who cloaked herself so carefully could appear here, so exposed. I replied that photographs are treacherous, they trap what people wish to hide, as if light itself were a detective. I turned the picture over. On the back, in faded ink, was a date, June 1987. That was long before Ashton's lecture series on witch trials, long before the anonymous letters. Still, the past has a way of extending its hand into the present. I stared at the number 7 in the year it had been retraced, written over, as though someone had wished to reinforce it. An unnecessary gesture. And yet unnecessary gestures often tell more than deliberate ones. Lewis suggested we show the picture to Dr. Blake. I refused. Better first to see who noticed its absence. A photograph misplaced carries more weight than one displayed. It unsettles those who expect control of their memories. I slipped it back into the folder, deliberately leaving the corner protruding. By evening, the folder had been returned to the lodge. If the image vanished by morning, I would know its owner had come to reclaim it. Night fell with the usual drizzle. I poured myself whiskey and set about the crossword. One clue seemed to be written for me. Picture mistake. 7 letters. The answer miscarried with a clarity that was unsettled. Miscast. A word that implies not only error, but deliberate choice, someone placed where they should never have belonged. The woman in black, intruding upon a summer garden party. Ashton drowned where he should not have wandered, even myself perhaps drawn again into corridors that smelled of old paper and loss. I slept poorly, and by dawn I returned to the lodge. Graham greeted me with the weariness of a man who had seen little and heard less. The folder sat where I had left it, but the photograph was gone. I asked after it casually, remarking that a picture had been mislaid. He blinked, confused, and insisted no one had touched the desk. Lewis accused me of inventing ghosts, yet absence is never an invention. Something once present had been taken. That was proof enough. Later, in the quad, I watched Elkins cross toward the chapel. She carried a book bound with ribbon, her step quicker than usual, her gaze averted. Fielding lingered near the cloisters, pretending to light a cigarette, though the flame never caught. Blake descended the stair with a measured calm, papers aligned in his hand. None looked guilty, and yet all three seemed aware of something missing. The air itself seemed to tilt towards silence. That evening, alone once more, I thought of the woman in the photograph, her gaze holding mine across years. Was she warning or confessing? Was she even alive, or only an apparition fixed by accident? I could not say, but I knew that whoever retrieved the picture had carried away not merely paper and ink, but a truth I had almost touched. And truths, once misplaced, seldom return unchanged. The chapel was cold that evening, though the candles had burned for hours, and the choir had rehearsed until their voices thinned into silence. I sat with Lewis in the back pew, listening to the echo of footsteps retreating down the nave, and it struck me again how Oxford prefers its secrets wrapped in music. Notes rise, reverberate, then dissolve, leaving only the suspicion that something was once there. Fielding lingered at the organ, shuffling his sheets of music with more noise than necessary. His fingers hovered above the keys, then pressed down in a hesitant chord that jarred against the quiet air. Lewis whispered that the man had talent, if not much, subtlety. I said talent is seldom the question, and truth has its own pitch, recognizable when struck, impossible to disguise once heard. I walked to the front, asked Fielding what he was playing. He said it was Bird, though the bar he had stumbled over belonged to Tallis. He looked embarrassed, muttered something about tiredness. But tiredness does not alter the name of the composer, only the steadiness of the hand. I marked it quietly as the first false note. Elkins entered soon after, carrying a book against her chest, as though shielding it from the draught. She asked Fielding if he intended to practice further. He smiled too quickly and said he was done. She moved to leave, but as she passed me the ribbon of her book slipped loose, and a photograph slid to the floor. She bent swiftly to recover it, her hand covering the image before I could see more than a shadow of a face. She apologized, claiming it was nothing, but photographs are never nothing. Another false note, though unplayed. Outside the rain had returned, soft and insistent against the chapel stones. Lewis asked if I truly believed these trivialities meant anything. I told him a symphony is composed of trivialities, only when aligned do they become music. He shook his head, muttered about my habit of turning whispers into sermons. Perhaps he was right. Yet the whispers were growing louder. Back in my room, I poured a measure of whiskey and opened the crossword. One clue lingered, unfinished error in performance. 5 letters. The answer was slip. Simple, obvious, perhaps too much so. Still the word carried its own resonance. A slip of fingers on organ keys, a slip of ribbon releasing a hidden photograph, a slip of composure in words spoken too quickly. Slips, all of them forming a pattern more deliberate than coincidence. The following morning we visited Blake in his study. He greeted us with the measured courtesy of a man who distrusts intrusion. His papers, as always, lay arranged in strict order upon the desk. Yet one sheet had been folded differently, its crease sharper, more recent than the rest. I asked whether he had enjoyed the rehearsal the night before. He claimed not to have attended, though a faint trace of candle wax clung to his sleeve. Another note out of key, heard, if not admitted. Lewis asked him directly whether Ashton had been troubled by threats. Blake adjusted his spectacles, saying Ashton had been troubled only by his own conscience. I wondered whose conscience Blake spoke of, Ashton's or his own. The room smelled of stale tobacco, though Blake insisted he never smoked. Silence followed, thick and unmoving, like dust left too long undisturbed. When we left, Lewis remarked that everyone seemed to be lying. I said not lying, merely playing in the wrong key. The difficulty is not in hearing the error, but in knowing which melody it betrays. That night, long after the city had hushed itself to sleep, I replayed the fragments in my mind of Fielding's mistaken composer, Elkins's concealed photograph, Blake's wax upon his sleeve. False notes, each of them, scattered across different staves. I could not yet hear the whole composition, but I knew it was there, waiting for the listener to be patient enough to follow its hidden score. The rain continued against the window, steady, faithful. I finished the crossword at last. The word slipped neatly into the final square. Yet even then I could not shake the thought that the greater error was mine, listening always for truth, but hearing only the echo of its absence. The service had not yet begun when I entered the chapel, but already the air was weighted with expectation. Candles flickered along the stone, their smoke mingling with the smell of damp wood and polish. I chose a place near the back, as I often did, where the shadows felt less conspicuous. Lewis sat beside me, uneasy, in the way he always was when the ceremony intruded upon duty. He whispered that we had better things to do than listen to hymns. I told him the better things often wait, but the small things rarely repeat themselves. He frowned, but stayed silent. The choir filed in, their gowns whispering against the pews, their faces trained toward reverence. The organ breathed its first deep note, a sound that reached into the ribs like memory. Then they began to sing. The hymn was one I had known since childhood, though I could not remember where I first learned it. The words rose, familiar, until they faltered. It was Elkin's. Her voice, usually pure and precise, carried a single misplaced word, slight enough to escape most ears. Instead of singing mercy, she gave mourning. A slip of syllables, yet enough to darken the whole verse. I saw her eyes flicker down toward the score, then quickly away. Fielding glanced at her, lips tightening, as though the mistake had betrayed more than a line of song. Blake, conducting from the front, did not turn his head, but I noticed his hand pause, one beat longer than required, before resuming the measure. Silence within sound. The hymn continued, but the missing word lingered long after the verse was finished. Lewis asked if I had heard it. I nodded. He shrugged, said it was nothing. But nothing seldom echoes so loudly. Words betray more than notes ever can, mourning instead of mercy, a truth unbidden. After the service I remained behind while the others filed out. The stone floor creaked as Elkins gathered her books, the ribbon once more slipping loose. I caught only a glimpse of the photograph within, a shadow of faces blurred, before she tucked it away. She did not look at me, yet I knew she felt watched. Fielding spoke to her in a low tone, words I could not catch, his hand brushing her sleeve too familiarly. She pulled away, gently, but with finality. Another hymn unsung. Blake approached me as I lingered by the organ loft. He remarked that students often falter when tired, that slips of the tongue are meaningless. I told him perhaps, though meaning seldom disguises itself so easily. He smiled thinly, reminding me that scholars must not mistake poetry for fact. I answered that fact is often concealed within poetry, waiting for the right ear. He said nothing more, but his eyes moved to the candle wax at the corner of the lectern, hardened drops betraying his presence at nights he claimed to have spent elsewhere. Later, as Lewis and I crossed the quad, the rain returned, light but insistent. He asked again why one wrong word mattered. I told him that hymns, like crosswords, allow no substitution. Each word carries weight, and to alter one alters all. He laughed quietly, said I gave too much importance to trifles. I asked if he remembered yesterday's crossword clue word, wrongly placed, 7 letters. He shook his head. The answer was anagram, letters shifted, meaning transformed. Elkins's hymn had been its own anagram, rearranging mercy into mourning. A mistake, perhaps, or a revelation. Back in my room, I poured whiskey, the glass warm in my hand. I thought of Ashton by the river, of the letters left in the porter's lodge, of the photograph vanished before it could speak. I thought of the woman in black, her voice unheard but her silence louder than any hymn. And I thought of Elkins, her single missing word hanging in the chapel, like incense. Mourning. It was not a cry for forgiveness, it was something nearer to confession. The city outside hushed itself into night, rain tapping the panes with its steady rhythm. I set aside the crossword, unfinished, the squares still waiting for words not yet spoken. Some mistakes, I knew, are more deliberate than truths, and some hymns, once altered, can never be sung the same again. The college cloister has its own voice, though it seldom raises it. Each step along its worn flag seems to murmur of centuries past, as though the stone itself carried the weight of prayers, secrets, betrayals. That night I walked alone, the rain having paused just long enough to leave the air cool and damp, the lamps casting narrow cones of yellow that seemed more shadow than light. I had come to meet no one, yet I was not surprised when someone waited for me there. Elkin stood by the statue in the corner niche, her book pressed tight against her chest. The stone figure above her, worn smooth by time, looked less like a saint and more like a sentinel. She asked if I believed in confessions. I said belief was not required, only listening. She lowered her eyes and said she had nothing to confess. Then why stand beneath the stone, I asked, where every word seems bound to echo? She did not answer, but I noticed her knuckles whitening as she gripped the ribbon tied around her book. Ribbons are meant to bind, yet they also conceal. I wondered which it was in her case. Lewis had followed, though at a distance. He leaned against the far arch, pretending indifference, yet his gaze remained fixed upon us. I told her we could walk, and she nodded, falling into step beside me. The sound of her shoes against the wet floor was lighter than mine, yet each beat carried a tension, as if she counted them. She asked if Ashton had suffered. I replied that the river does not prolong things, it is not cruel, only indifferent. She whispered then that cruelty requires intention. I asked if she knew whose intention it had been. She shook her head, though too quickly, the denial rehearsed. A false note, even in silence. We paused beneath the great archway. The stone here carried the moisture of the night, cold to the touch. I placed my hand against it and asked if she had ever felt guilty for something she had not done. She said always, "Guilt," she added, "is easier to carry than suspicion." I did not argue, but I thought of the hymn missing, of the photograph reclaimed, of the woman in black whose footsteps had echoed through the city. Suspicion and guilt seemed less like separate burdens and more like twin weights on the same scale. Lewis approached at last, impatient. He asked if she had told me anything of value. I said she had told me everything, though none of it could be written in reports. He sighed, muttered about ghosts again, and returned to the far side of the cloister, leaving us with the stone. Elkins asked if I had solved my crossword. "Not yet," I answered. She smiled faintly as though she knew the clue. Then she turned and walked away, her ribbon loosening once more, the book slipping slightly, but never falling. I did not call her back. When I returned to my room, I found the paper still open on the table. The clue that lingered was a declaration carved in permanence. 10 letters. For a long while I stared at it, the answer resisting. Then it came, almost too plain an inscription, a word that belongs to stone, to permanence, to memory, etched beyond revision. The confession in stone is not spoken nor written in ink, but pressed into the world where no one may erase it. I poured whiskey and thought of Ashton, of the letters left at the lodge, of the bruise at his temple. I thought of Blake's ordered papers, of Fielding's misnamed composers, of Elkins's trembling words. I thought of the woman in black, whose silence had always been louder than words. Somewhere among them lay the inscription, the truth, carved deep, though half concealed by moss and shadow. I had not yet found it, but I could feel its shape beneath my hand, the stone cold, the letters worn smooth by time and denial. The city outside lay hushed, again the rain beginning once more upon the panes. I knew that no confession would be spoken aloud. Oxford does not grant such mercy. Its truths are written in corridors, in hymns missing, in photographs reclaimed, in footsteps counted against the stone. And if I had learned anything, it was that the stone always remembers, even when we choose to forget. The boy's voice had once lifted the roof of the chapel, or so they said. I never heard it, not in life. Only in the tremor of recollection, older dons described the way he could climb the scale as though climbing sunlight. But death diminishes all superlatives. By the time I came to the story, he was no longer a boy, not even a memory. He was a whisper, half believed, pressed into the stones of the choir stalls. They called him the choirboy's ghost. Lewis dismissed it. Superstition, he said. Every college has its tales, its candlelit spectres. He asked why we were wasting time listening to the porter's mutterings when Ashton's drowning was real enough. I told him the truth hides itself in rumour more often than in facts. He shook his head, and I let him. The porter claimed the boy's ghost walked on nights of heavy rain, humming a hymn slightly off-key. I asked him what the hymn was, but he could not say. A snatch of Latin, perhaps, or something simpler. He had only ever heard the tune, and only when alone. I asked how long ago the boy had died. He said long enough for the chapel wood to forget the sound of his breathing, though not long enough for the stone to forget his song. Such are the measurements of Oxford. Later, I returned alone. The chapel was unlit, save for a single lamp left burning by the organ. The rain outside fell in threads, steady and without wind, the sort that fills silence with its own rhythm. I sat in the back pew and waited. The ghost, of course, did not come, but I heard something else, the faintest creak of the floorboards near the stalls, as though someone shifted weight without daring to breathe. When I turned, I saw Fielding, his face pale in the half-light. He asked if I had heard the ghost. I asked what he was doing there. He said he often practiced in the evenings when no one was left to judge him. His hand brushed the wood of the stall as he spoke, a gesture oddly tender, almost reverent. He told me he believed the boy had drowned in the Cherwell too. I asked who told him. He said no one. Then he corrected himself that he had read it somewhere in an old archive. But archives do not record ghosts, only facts. And the fact was that Ashton had drowned where the boy once had. Coincidence, he said quickly. Coincidence is a word that grows thinner the more one repeats it. I left him there, his hand still upon the wood. The rain had thickened by the time I reached the quad. Lewis waited, his coat collar turned up, his face disapproving. He asked if I had seen anything. I told him I had seen a man speaking with the dead. He asked which man. I did not answer. Back in my room, I unfolded the crossword. A clue remained unsolved. Shade of a departed child, 6 letters. I considered phantom, but it did not fit. Then I saw its spirit. Too simple, yet unavoidable. Spirit, both presence and resolve, both hymn and silence. I wrote it in the square and felt the unease of answers that do not answer. Elkins passed me the next morning in the corridor, her eyes lowered, her ribboned book pressed tighter than ever. She asked softly if I had heard the singing. I said no, not yet. She nodded, as though relieved, or perhaps disappointed. It struck me then that the ghost, if one wished to call it that, lived not in the chapel, but in the minds of those who had something to bury. And so the choirboy's ghost lingered with me, not as voice, not as spectre, but as silence too measured to be accidental, a silence rehearsed like a hymn withheld. I could not banish it, nor, I suspected, did I wish to. The case reached its end not with revelation nor triumph, but with a sound so slight it might have been mistaken for memory. A single note drawn from the organ pipes at dusk, long after the chapel had emptied. I stood in the aisle, listening as it trembled into silence, uncertain whether it had been played by human hand or by the draught that moved through the stone. Oxford never clarifies, it prefers to remind. Lewis had told me earlier that we had enough to close the matter. The report would speak of Ashton's drowning as an accident, his scattered papers, and the missing photograph as incidental. He said no jury could convict on whispers and half-remembered hymns. I told him perhaps he was right. Then why did it feel so much like a verdict already written? He said, because I wanted it to be. I did not reply. Wanting has little to do with truth. And truth, I suspected, had long since slipped beneath the Cherwell, carried away with the silt. I walked once more through the college, the corridors cool, the floors creaking as they always did when no one else was near. Blake's study door was closed, the light beneath it steady. Elkins passed me in the stairwell, her ribbon tied firmer now, her book clutched as though she had learned not to let it slip. She met my eyes for an instant, then lowered them again, the way guilty and innocent alike lowered their gaze when they felt observed. Fielding was in the quad, practicing scales under his breath, his lips moving without sound, all of them carrying on, rehearsing their lives with the diligence of choristers awaiting a conductor's signal. And Ashton remained only in the margins, underlined once, retrieved no more. That night, I sat at my desk with the crossword. Only one clue remained unfinished. Ending of a melody, 4 letters. But the answer was coda. A final passage that does not belong to the main theme, yet without which the music feels incomplete. I wrote it in, the ink soaking heavily into the paper, and I realized the case had been precisely that of a coda, an ending appended, not explained, leaving the score altered but unresolved. Lewis came to pour himself a whiskey, though he did not drink it. He said he disliked leaving matters hanging. I told him everything in Oxford hangs. Portraits, histories, questions. He asked what I believed Ashton had known that condemned him. I said nothing certain, perhaps only that history, like music, repeats itself until someone dares to alter the note. Lewis muttered that I spoke in riddles. Perhaps I did, but riddles at least acknowledge their own incompleteness. I thought again of the hymn Elkins had missed, of the woman in black pausing at a darkened window, of Blake's sleeve brushed with wax, of Fielding naming the wrong composer. Each a slip, each a false note. Together they formed a harmony too deliberate to ignore, though no ear but mine seemed willing to hear it. The truth lay somewhere within those measures, but like the final chord of the organ that evening, it faded before it could be claimed. Outside, the rain began again, the faithful accompaniment to every Oxford night. I opened the window and let the sound in, steady, unyielding, carrying no answer but its own persistence. I wondered if the choirboy's ghost still walked beneath the vault, humming the wrong tune, reminding the living of what the dead refused to release. If so, he was not alone. Ashton's silence had joined him. The last note, whether played by hand or wind, remains with me still. Not because it concluded anything, but because it refused to. A sound held too long until it collapsed under its own weight, leaving the air troubled and unresolved. That was how the case ended. No confessions, no neat solution, only the ache of something half understood, echoing into the spaces where certainty should have been. And perhaps that is all a detective ever receives, the faintest echo carried across stone and rain, asking only to be heard before it fades.